I was originally going to update my roast of a certain Russian stealth fighter this week, but I went to a local bar this past weekend and got distracted by a couple Mustangs, a Corvette, a Chevy Bel Air, and this 1968 Camaro, and was immediately reminded of that time when a Danish mad lad took his Camaro and drove through the streets of Bosnia armed with nothing but a pocket knife and his Bible to deliver humanitarian aid to starving kids in the middle of a war zone solely because he wanted to. Today we're going to take a bit of a turn left from airplanes and talk about the story of the only Camaro to ever see combat, the Ghost Camaro, and how it came to race through the streets of a war-torn Far Eastern country originally called Yugoslavia. See, in 1980, the president of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito, died and left something of a power vacuum behind him. While officials in the Serbian city capital of Belgrade tried to keep the place unified, they couldn't stop factions from leveraging far-reaching religious and ethnic ties to divide the population, which eventually resulted in multiple different chunks breaking away and trying to declare independence in 1990. This would result in the first of a series of civil wars, and in 1992, the conflict would hit a fever pitch in Bosnia. By this point, the country had shattered into enough pieces that the first 2 years of the Bosnian Civil War would see 3 different factions in open conflict against each other in the streets. And there's no way I'm making a joke about that, because this conflict was horrifying. The brutality was on a level not seen since the Second World War, and the United Nations would refer to the entire space as a war crime. They would try to send help in the form of supply and humanitarian aid convoys, but these convoys were largely unescorted and became giant targets for the 3 sides and various bands of bandits lurking about, as they would either raid the convoys directly or charge hefty fees to allow passage. Eventually, this became too much, and certain areas of the conflict zone were rendered off limits, including the country of Herzegovina, which resulted in many families and children being stuck in the middle of a live-fire war zone with no one to help them. Until he showed up. Enter today's anime protagonist, Helge Meyer. This guy was the fighting equivalent of the phrase,
"Thank you, sir. May I have another?"
He was a Danish Jaeger Corps member who had trained with German paratroopers, Green Berets, and the Danish Frogmen. Stop. You need to understand the gravity of this. The Jaeger Corps is a Danish spec ops unit that focuses on land operations. The Frogmen focus on maritime operations. The German paratroopers taught him to win a slap-fighting contest with the planet, and the Green Berets taught him to stack regimes. I'm trying to tell you that if this guy ever comes after you, the most productive thing you're going to do with your newest last day ever is to try and guess what your country's replacement is going to look like. He was a madman even to his own trainees, because starting in 1972, he would drag them along on 100-kilometer or 62-mile walks through tall sand dunes and water, and that was when he was feeling nice. He would usually kick it up to 200 or even 300 kilometers, and that was with a maximum allowance of a liter of water and a dealer's choice of either 200 grams of chocolate or 20 cigarettes. And I find the implication that the 2 of those are equal to be hilarious. The trainees probably didn't though, because even when they weren't wearing gas masks to make breathing harder, no one was allowed to talk. I can't even go for 30 minutes without talking to myself even when I don't need expert advice, and these guys couldn't talk at all. And if soldiers did decide to drop out, they were given a card describing them as, quote, weak, which gave instructions to any driver they flagged down on where to drop them off on their way back. And Meyer called these hardcore training jaunts psychological walks.
I take enthusiastic walks through the woods.
And kill homicidal vampire priests.
Very enthusiastic walks.
And yet, despite his intense training attitude and literally being a Helsing reference, Meyer was intensely religious, and after retirement, he had been watching the civil wars in Yugoslavia from his TV at home in Denmark and wanted to provide for the abandoned civilians in the region. So when he learned that the UN convoys and trucks were getting ambushed or told by raiders to the point of withdrawal, he felt compelled by God to come out of retirement and do something about it. And he got an idea. The plan Meyer came up with was simple. If large supply quantities couldn't get out there during the day under standard speed, then he'd get smaller amounts out there at night at freedom speed, which meant acquiring a vehicle he could upgrade for the mission. It'd be expensive and it was risky, and because of that, a lot of humanitarian aid groups would turn down his proposal. They didn't realize this man was the closest thing to a living embodiment of a force of nature. Finding a way is what he does, no matter how crazy it sounds. And in 1991, he went to the one group of people he knew would have no problem with making crazy a reality: the US military.
Not only do I have an idea, but I have a plan.
Meyer decided to reach out to an old connection he had gotten through his training, who just so happened to be the commander of the Rhine-Main Air Force Base in Germany, who was happy to try and get him something high speed he could work with. And that something was a car he ended up buying from a US serviceman for the mission, a 1979 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. The Camaro line of muscle cars was introduced in 1967 as Chevy's answer to the Ford Mustang, and after surpassing the Mustang in models sold in 1978, the 1979 model year of the Camaro was the most popular year of the entire lineage, with over 282,000 models sold. It would accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 8.7 seconds thanks to a 350 cubic inch V8 pumping out 170 horsepower. 350 cubic inches being the total internal volume of the engine cylinders, better known as the engine's displacement, and V8 standing for the 8 cylinders being placed in blocks of 4 mounted together in a V shape. This power output was transferred to the wheels via a close ratio 4-speed manual transmission, meaning that you would stick shift between 4 gear settings for forward driving that had intervals for changing RPM and torque output that were closer together than your average transmission. A close ratio transmission was designed to keep the engine operating within RPM ranges, or revolution per minute ranges, that produce the most optimal fuel consumption or power output, which are usually referred to as the power band. To better control the car in high-speed turns, the heavy-duty suspension came with sway bars, which are U-shaped bars connected to the suspensions on each end and with a torsion spring in the middle. What that does is it resists the swaying motion caused by a car taking a turn, which lets the Camaro take faster turns without rolling over. It was a solid car for the job, but the Air Force mechanics knew it was going to need more. And they got down to brass tacks of every mechanic's childhood dream of mil-specking an old muscle car until it looked straight out of Mad Max. First, they took out everything Meyer wouldn't need, like the radio, heater, and a bunch of other miscellaneous garbage to lighten the base frame as much as possible. Then it was time to armor up, because if you're going to spend a lot of time living in the fast lane at night, it would be wise of you to carry a generous amount of protection. They dipped the whole car in a vat of armor plating and threw on some Kevlar inserts for the doors, on top of steel sheets to cover the floor pan and rear windshield. The latter of which was important because that rear windshield was so expensive that your wallet would weigh more afterwards if you totaled the car. Now that he's flying with a makeshift Razorback, they gave him a few more durability upgrades by adding a landmine clearing plow to the front and injecting polyurethane foam into the tires, which cures into a harder structure and made them puncture resistant. And you might be tempted to believe that all that extra weight would make the car slower, and you'd be right. So the mechanics tuned the 170 horsepower engine up to 220 and then added a get out of jail free card of a 200 shot of nitrous in what I can only assume was a single stage injection. Pause. I need you to understand how insane that is, starting with some explanations for the not car junkies. A car uses a shot of nitrous to increase the horsepower output of the engine by the shot amount by injecting nitrous oxide gas into the engine cylinder. So a 200 shot is a 200 horsepower increase. Now, I don't know if you've ever dealt with liquid nitrogen before, but the way it works is it has to be stored under either extreme cold or extreme pressure in order to shelve any significant quantities. A bottle of nitrous is stored at high pressure and rests as part liquid, part gas inside the bottle. When nitrous is injected into the cylinder, that gas evaporates and the pressure drops, which supercools it. Then the inside of the cylinder becomes communist for a second and shares the cold with the rest of the air, because the cold nitrous mixes with the regular air inside the cylinder and decreases the overall temperature. This is because of a little scientific rule called the ideal gas law, which connects the dots on the properties of gases under most conditions. Since everything's got to be equal on both sides of the equation, when the temperature of some amount of air decreases, so does the pressure. Therefore, by making the air in the cylinder colder, it actually compresses it in the same way a turbocharger would, but by using a chemical instead of a machine. This means the cylinder draws in more air to level the pressure, which lets you burn more gas and get more power from every stroke of the piston. On top of that, because the nitrous was being used in a carbureted engine, the car actually had to use something called a fogger plate to inject it. This is a metal plate that lets the nitrous in from metal pipes when the driver hits an electronic switch and ejects it through a manually configured shot-specific jet nozzle into the cylinder along with the fuel. And because the gas is entering at high pressure, it actually causes the fuel to atomize or break up into individual atoms along with the nitrous gas. This allows the fuel to recombine with the oxygen atoms in the nitrous while also creating nitrogen gas, both of which become enriched fuel sources. So when the spark plug fires, you actually effectively have a chilled, double enriched fuel that also sucks in more air, creating a burn hot enough to emasculate the sun.
Oh!
However, because this increases the pressure of the cylinder, when it comes to shots of about 200 or more, engines need to be modified or the injection slowed down to prevent the engine from either warping, seizing up, and throwing a connecting rod, or just outright blowing up the cylinders. Modifying the engine can come in the form of filing out the gap between the lubricating rings until it's somewhere between 28 and 35 thousandths of an inch to prevent those rings from fusing together under the added heat and subsequent thermal expansion, which would quickly deprive the engine of oil, making it lock up. Alternatively, a modder can use a multi-stage injector, which adds the total shot and a few rapid-fire smaller parts, which stops the engine from blowing out the tires because you decided to jumpstart the wrath of God. Or at the very least, they can swap out the pistons and any other desired parts for forged parts, which are made of a stronger metal alloy than the hyper-eutectic steel used in most car engines and don't deform as easily. And as far as I've been able to find, the Camaro did none of that.
He did what in his cup?
The Air Force straight up handed this guy a 200 shot of nitrous and probably a single stage injector on a bone stock 350 engine to use in case of emergency for a total of 420 horsepower going balls to the wall. Forget having the fastest hands this side of the Mississippi, this is the fastest war machine this side of the Atlantic, because even loaded with 800 pounds of supplies, it could still go from 0 to 120 miles per hour in 13 seconds. And as if that wasn't enough, then they went and kitted it out for night ops. They wired up a GPS system, a ground-to-air radio, an automatic fire extinguisher, a thermal imaging camera, and IR floodlights in case he had to pull a Bravo 6, and then they blacked out the windows, removed the interior lights, and dimmed the dashboard and quieted the exhaust. And if that sounds like the acoustic humanitarian equivalent of an F-22 Raptor, then you better hold on to your socks because the Air Force guys upped their game and found some spray cans of paint lying around for the F-117 Nighthawk stealth bomber. This matte black paint absorbs both radar and heat, making the Ghost Camaro basically invisible at night to radar scopes, thermal sights, and the naked eye. The only thing that didn't get the stealth treatment was a yellow rubber ducky mounted in the front of the engine grill.
The magic-tastical, back-flipping rubber duck!
That sounds really expensive. Who paid for all of that? Okay, Karen, first of all, I'm pretty sure helping kids in a war zone outweighs the price tag regardless. And second, the check was covered by the US Army and through donations from soldiers on base. The Air Force then managed to get together an additional $12,000 of food, water, clothes, blankets, toys, and other humanitarian aid, and then gave him a Kevlar helmet, a bulletproof vest, combat knife, and a tomahawk. Eventually, even the German Bundeswehr and Lego helped donate supplies for his runs, using his Spec Ops expertise to make sure he targeted delivery locations that would get the goods he delivered used best, and drew them out using invisible ink, only visible under a blacklight. But when he was offered a gun, he refused and held up his German Bible, stating that God was the only protection he needed and promised to paint a new page gold for every successful run he completed. And while the car's upgrades would do their jobs, as Meyer started making his runs, blasting through minefields and running from AK-firing maniacs with many a bullet deflecting off the rear plate, there were a few incidents that really made it seem like God really was all the protection he needed.
My faith is my shield!
One time he's driving around at night and gets hit in the head really hard. He comes back to his senses, gets the heck out of Dodge, and after the mission checks his helmet. Turns out there was a sniper hiding in a building somewhere who'd gotten a headshot off on him, and the round had gotten stuck in his Kevlar helmet mere inches from his skull. On a different night, the Camaro was driving up a mountain when the car stalled out and stopped, then began rolling back downhill. He hadn't detected any issues that would lead the car to seem dysfunctional, so he restarted the engine and tried again. Again, the car failed going uphill in the exact same spot. He tried a few more times, but again and again, the car stalled in the same exact place and fell back down. Meyer weighed his options and decided to take this as a sign from God, at which point he parked in some nearby ruins and slept for the night. The next day, he attempted the incline again, and inexplicably, this time the car worked, and he made it to his destination. But when he went to explain his tardiness to the people living there, they were shocked and explained to him that there had been bandits robbing and killing drivers coming down the road that night, and Meyer had only avoided getting raided because of the Camaro's inexplicable engine stalls.
Well, I'll be damned.
After completing his run, Meyer thanked God and continued on his journeys. However, God was not the only protector he had, because Meyer had adapted to the lawless environment well and used his wits to help him. For one run, he had a passenger with him and was rolling up to a police checkpoint getting ready to pass through it. Meyer, always on the lookout for danger in the most minute forms, realized that something was off about the guard detail. They weren't wearing the right shoes for a police uniform. He immediately comes to the realization these guys weren't actually local police, but bandits who had taken over the stop, and they would most likely stop him for good if he didn't come up with a plan now. So he puts on a headscarf, lights a cigar, and puts on his studded leather gloves and instructs his passenger to throw a black cloth over his flashlight to make it look like a gun, as well as to look menacing and lock the door. The idea was to put up a visual front to reduce the likelihood that they'd get closely examined by the guard detail. But to reinforce the plan, he had one last instruction for his passenger: to rip ass. This would add the element of smell to the plan and make it so unbearable in the cabin that the bandits wouldn't want to spend too much time asking questions. And after a short interaction, Helga sped through the gates and put a quick effort into maintaining relations as he roared away.
Greetings.
While the Bosnian Civil War came to an end in 1995 after 3 years of fighting, there were still over 2 million people displaced, and even though the enemies of the region had placed a bounty on his car, Helga continued making supply runs throughout the entire country. But of all the runs he made, one stood out a little more than others, that being a trip to the city of Varas. While he was in the city that night, he noticed a candle flickering through a broken window on his thermal imaging system in the car. He walks up to the door and knocks on it. The candle quietly goes out. Undeterred, he knocks again and announces that he's with the US Army. The door slowly opens to reveal an older man and a younger woman with a newborn baby, all of which were clearly malnourished and covered in dirt. He quickly went back to his car and brought them food, water, baby food, and soap, and after they had finished cleaning up, he spent some time at the table with the old man, who read his Quran while Meyer read his Bible. Eventually it was time to sleep, and he went into his Camaro for the evening, and as he was about to shuffle into his sleeping bag, he heard a knock on the windshield. The mother had come out to the car with her newborn baby, and after he rolls down the windshield to ask what's wrong, the mother leans over and places her baby on Meyer's bare chest and lets him hold it. Meyer noted this was the moment that stands out to him most of all of his adventures even to this day. And that's out of his 100 trips made both during and after the war, carrying nothing but his Bible and a knife. These heroic actions earned him the nickname of God's Rambo, a name translated into German for the title of his book on the ordeal, Gottes Rambo. Helga Meyer still lives in Germany today and still has the Camaro despite all of his wife's protests. Meyer lovingly calls the car his warhorse and credits his survival to his Green Beret training and guardian angels, who he claims watched over him during his journeys. And while I can't say I have the balls or gangster energy to drive an up-armored Mad Max mobile into a war zone, I would like to make some kids' lives better, but I'll need your help to do it. This week, I will be working with a charity called Gamers Outreach, and what they do is get gaming equipment out to kids in hospitals, because a lot of kids don't really understand why a hospital stay can feel so different to them and so isolating and overwhelming. Giving them something fun and entertaining to play with while they're staying helps them relax and make memories while they feel more comfortable with getting better. They can even be used to directly aid with recovery or for education to help kids learn new things as they recover, which I can understand. I mean, I make videos about aerospace engineering and planes while looking like a video game narrator. The goal this year for me and my crew over at the Adventurers Guild is to raise $1,000 for them to directly fund portable gaming kiosks, toys to incentivize recovery goals, and training and management tools for volunteers. And if I'm doing my math right, we could blow that goal away harder than a buff carpet bombing run if everybody who sees this before the end of Halloween of 2024 donates just $1 via the link on screen. It'd mean a good bit to me, but it would matter way more to all those kids if we could turn this video into something more than a story. So so let's give it a Hail Mary. Thank you for watching. If you like what you saw, please consider checking out my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.